This is part 3 in a series of videos I've been doing recently about poetics, and specifically the poetics of what I referred to in the first video as of the poetics of the impersonal. Then the second one, the poetics of the personal. In this one I want to try and join the dots up between those two. It'll probably be 2 videos this one, I'll probably have to span it over 2 because I want to try and flesh out the background and then dedicate a small amount of time specifically on this third poetics, the poetics of the connective or something, I don't know, whatever. Okay, a bit of background first off. What do I mean by poetics? What I'm not talking about there is specifically about, it's about poetry really, although having said that I kind of have to talk a little bit about poetry. What I'm really talking about there is a set of ideas that comes out of a discipline called poetic cognition. Poetic cognition, which is a subset of some ideas that come out of cognitive neuroscience and evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology, and I'll see if I can explain that in a sec. But basically the idea is this, is that thinking, this kind of stuff that goes on in our heads, cognition, has a lot in common with the processes that poets use when they take language and turn it into poetry. Now that sounds quite an ambitious claim to make, so I'm going to need to spend a couple of minutes reinforcing that. Okay, the background, the deep background is this, that our brains, those things that do the thinking, along with the rest of the stuff of the world, but the locus of our individual thinking is the brain, and the brain has evolved over millions of years. That's pretty much straightforward stuff. But it originally evolved for very particular things. It evolved not to fulfill the functions it primarily fulfills now. It certainly didn't evolve to do the thing I'm doing now, which is talking and thinking. It evolved in the first place from really humble origins to allow some kind of an organism to survive in some kind of an environment. Specifically an organism of about this size, a kind of human scale organism, to survive in a human scale environment, this kind of Newtonian environment of middle-sized objects moving at middle speed, as Richard Dawkins puts it. And so all of the sensory motor systems we've got, all of the the kind of functions we carry out are providing the data that the brain processes and turns into experiences. That's what the brain originally evolved for, to allow this body to function in this environment, pretty much. And these senses, of course, the processing of sense data is really important to that. The stuff of the world turns into the stuff of experiences using the brain. That's what it does, and it does that by having very specific circuits. There are specific circuits which do that process and evolved for that purpose. But of course that's not all we do now. We don't just kind of wander through the world making sure we don't bump into trees, and we don't just spend our time identifying prey and moving away from predators and identifying food sources and appropriate mates and those kind of things. We spend most of our time, and certainly all of our more interesting time, the stuff that we privilege, we spend that engaged in forms of cognition which have no survival value at all, which are basically abstract. We think about abstract things, we don't think about those concrete things very much at all. We think about love, and we think about politics, and we think about the law, and we think about morality, and we think about the abstract ideas you find in strange science. That's what we spend our time doing and thinking about. So how do we do it is the question. And coming out of these disciplines that I mentioned, like poetic cognition, the idea is that we do that using the circuits that were originally laid down to allow this kind of body to function in this kind of environment, human scale bodies functioning in medium-sized environments. And so we're basically reusing all those old circuits to do this new stuff. And in that reusing, all kinds of poetries emerge. Let me just give an example of what I mean by that. If you take an abstract concept like love, like a love affair. Clearly a love affair is abstract. You can't hold it against the wall and photograph it. You hold it in your hand, you can't touch it, smell it. It doesn't make any impact on the sensory motor system at all, and yet we're able to think about it and talk about it. And that requires an explanation. And the explanation is, that comes out of those disciplines I just talked about. Guy, come here. Is that we're mobilising, or we have the option to mobilise, one of a series of circuits in our brain to to allow us to do it. And probably one of the primary ones for something like love affairs is circuits that were originally laid down to understand journeys and to make some kind of general understandings of journeys. Because I've always made journeys. I'm making a journey now. I make thousands of journeys a day, and our ancestors have always made journeys. Animals make journeys, and they all have common features. They all have starting points. They all have trajectories that they go on. They all have landmarks that they pass. They all have goals that they eventually reach or don't reach. So they've all got these common features, and that circuit which maps out what a journey is, and which has been there hardwired in our brain for millions of years, is one that we might use to understand a love affair. So we might, for example, and it's revealed in our language, so we might, for example, talk about a love affair going through a rough patch, or going off the rails, or going smoothly, we might say, or it might meet an obstacle, or it might come to an end. You know, all these kind of metaphors, all this figurative speech reveals the figurative thinking that's going on in our minds, and that figuration, that poetic thinking, is going on because we're using the circuits that were originally laid down to understand journeys to think about something that otherwise would be unobtainable to us, otherwise unthinkable. Okay, so that's a bit of background. That's the idea of poetic cognition. And metaphor isn't the only one. It could also be metonymy or synecdoche, irony, and techniques like compression, whereby lots of complex experiences are compressed into a single one. Onomatopoeic effects, where the sounds of words convey something of that visceral sensory motor quality. Things like rhythms and rhyming patterns. These are all techniques that poets use, but they're also found, so the theory goes, within the processes that our cognition goes through to allow us to understand abstract concepts. We're mobilizing old circuits for old vessels for new wine. We're putting old wine, whether it is, we're mobilizing old circuits to put into new use, repurposing them. Okay, need to go this way now, Pops, come on. So where am I going from that? Okay, so let me just revise the last two videos, and I'll make a separate video about the last bit I want to talk about. In the first video in this series, the poetics of the impersonal, I was really borrowing from Richard Dawkins' phrase where he says, I think it's in Devil's Chaplain, but I might be wrong, he says that science is the poetry of reality. And what I said in that video was, when he's talking about reality, he's not talking about personal reality, how you yourself feel that is real. He's talking about impersonal reality, the reality that doesn't go away when you stop believing in it, the reality that doesn't die with you when you die, the kind of stuff that stays around. The reality hasn't necessarily got people in it at all. It's the reality that science describes, a reality of kind of claims for eternal truth, claims for objectivity. It's that kind of reality he's talking about, and it's completely valid. I'm not making any suggestions that it's not valid, but the way we achieve that and the way we think about those things is by isolating a particular set of cognitive processes and linguistic processes which mirror those processes, ways of talking, ways of thinking, ways of writing, ways of behaving, which limit the amount of figurative language, limit the poetry to a very particular set, and deliberately exclude other bits of this poetic thinking. So in science writing, for example, or science thinking, or scientific procedures, we would do everything we could to eliminate the personal. We would try to eliminate personal bias. We would try to eliminate experimental effects. We would try to take ourselves out of the equation, and that would be completely right the way through the whole process. So the poetics of the impersonal, the poetry of reality, in Dawkins' way of thinking, is a poetry without us. In the second video, I said the converse of that there is another set of poetry, another set of poetics, which again draws from old circuits, reuses old circuits of the brain that were originally to do with the fact that here we are as bodies of a certain size and scale, and with certain sensory motor systems operating in an environment, using those same circuits, but instead of talking about the impersonal, we're using to talk about the personal. And a lot of the language about what it is to be a person, what it is to be a self, what it is to have consciousness, what it is to have an identity, draws upon a completely different set of figurative language and figurative thought. Often language to do with a being located in a particular spot, so we might talk about our viewpoint or our perspective or our standpoint on a particular issue, or the whole set of, it's too much to go into right now, but there's a whole completely different set of figurative language and figurative thought that goes on to describe and identify what it is to be a person and to have a personal relationship to the world. And that, as I say, that's often kept completely separate, and for good reason, kept completely separate to the poetry of reality and the poetics of the impersonal. Okay, I'm going to stop this here, but what I want to do in this next video is just to spend a couple of minutes talking about what I think is the poetry that joins those two things together, if I can.